As I went through academia and I was getting into my doctorate at Juilliard, I decided to focus my research on the music of Margaret Bonds and her relationship with the poet Langston Hughes. And it was almost like a divine intervention, because what I was realizing is that as I was approaching the end of my time as a student, it seemed like the research I was doing on Margaret Bonds, on Langston Hughes, two artists who were really deeply committed to uplifting the lives and the stories of their communities, that I had that on the one hand, but it didn't seem to jive with what I was doing on stage as a harpist. And as I got sort of further into that and I was, about to graduate, it seemed like those two worlds couldn't coexist. And so for me, when I'm thinking about anti-racism, I'm thinking about the music that I've studied my whole life, classical music. And if you think about how classical music really sort of depends on the exclusion of works by women, works of people of color, the deliberate elimination of those voices, then it seems as if the classical music system and anti-racist principles that we are championing in this group here don't go together. And what I hadn't realized at the time, but what I was starting to do, was create my own space. So that's what we'll be talking about. For me, programming is the most immediate and visible area where I think performers and presenters can begin to reimagine this classical music landscape. And so that's why I'm focusing it on here. And, when I think about terms like equity, the way I approach that, first, I'm recognizing connections between all kinds of people. That's at the heart of it, while celebrating differences. So we really need to have both. We need to have connections while celebrating differences. And that, for me, is what motivates me in my own work. So I'm going to touch on 3 different strategies. The first is thematic programming. The second is what I call reaching across the aisle. And I think here maybe we can think about that in the context of a discussion about Orlando. But I also think of it more broadly as just listening, right? And then thirdly, mixing it up. So it's sort of I don't want to say step-by-step process, but it's sort of how I approach my own projects. And again, I should say that if there are any comments or questions or things that you want to share that sort of fit what I'm talking about at the time, please feel free to do so. We're just a very small group. I think we're friendly enough to just jump in. All right, so the first, I'm talking about thematic and not tokenizing programming, because all too often we're still seeing programs that tokenize certain groups. And when we do that, we sort of marginalize them. We sort of say that this is a separate thing and it's not sort of on equal footing with everything else, right? For me, my goal is to see, for example, the majority of Black composers programmed outside of Black History Month. I would love to see that. Along those lines, I'd love to see no performances of Porgy and Bess during February, because we exist outside of that shortest month of the year. And thematic programming is something I've been doing for kind of as long as I could. I didn't realize it sort of at the beginning, but beginning with my master's recitals, I would come up with a title just as a way, a marketing tool to draw people in. And then as I became more intentional about it, I was realizing that I was trying to look for those connections. And now when I'm coming up with album ideas or programs or even sort of things to teach, I'm realizing that coming up with these broad themes is a great way to look for repertoire that might be overlooked. If you're really intentional about exploring all the different aspects of an idea, you're going to sort of look outside of the box. And then more importantly, it's also a great reminder that shared human experiences connect us across different cultures. And that's what we as performers are looking to do, looking to communicate, are these shared human experiences. So for example, I presented a short version of a recent project called Take Me to the Water at AHS in Los Angeles. I performed a full concert version in May, and then it will eventually be an album, hopefully in the next couple of years. But it began with my research on African-American spirituals and the frequent referencing of water. So it just, in the back of my mind, I was thinking about water as a metaphor for freedom in that particular repertoire. And I sort of stuck it there, but wanted to come back to it after I finished Ennanga. And I broadened it. I broadened it to looking at representations of water in West African mythology. And then I wanted to think about water as it is celebrated across the world. Almost every culture has some sort of way of acknowledging and being grateful for water. And so the program draws from a variety of genres. I started the concert with an Afro-Cuban chant about the goddess Yamaya, and I bleeded that into the first movement of the Debussy dances, which is based on a watercolor painting from the French Impressionist movement. And then from there, I also featured two spirituals, of course, Deep River and Take Me to the Water. But I've also now included a more contemporary piece by Leila Hula Lanzalotti called Kai Uli, which asks us to think about that beautiful color that is our oceans. And so that's just one example of, a title and a theme and a concept that I've applied. And it's really challenged me to, again, look outside of, the typical pieces that we might program, because ultimately I'm looking at speaking to as many different kinds of people. A question I've been asked often is, who are you thinking about when you program? Well, Robin, I'm actually thinking about my grandmother because, she was so supportive of me growing up. And it's almost like my way of still wanting to speak to her and just make sure that there's always something for her to have. And so that's just one example of, thematic programming that I've done recently. All right, number 2 is it's less technical. But, as we've been discussing concerns about traveling to Orlando, traveling to Texas, if we think about just the unthinkable atrocities that are happening in the Middle East, the directive to listen, at least for me tonight, is very powerful. Most of us are comfortable with what we already know. In this group, we're talking to we're kind of speaking to the converted, so to speak. We subscribe to the same podcasts. We keep relationships with friends who affirm what we already believe. But I have to wonder, and I think I still believe that learning really comes in those difficult moments, in those moments of discomfort, because it takes humility to what I, say, so to speak, to reach across the aisle, to listen to someone who doesn't look like you or doesn't believe the same things you do. And I think with listening comes understanding, and with understanding comes empathy. And so I want to sort of pause there and, I think we have a couple of minutes to maybe meditate or perhaps strategize ways that, going to Orlando can be maybe not something that we avoid, but rather a learning moment. I don't know. I don't have the answers. One sent me the email and I thought about it, and then, current events happen, and I'm hopeful that rather than shying away from it, we can use events like this to maybe learn about other sides of other ways of looking at things and maybe come out with a better understanding. So is there a way for the American Harp Society to use this as a teachable moment? Question mark. So if we take step 1, you have your thematic program. This reaching across the aisle, this listening action, really specifically or technically in this case means, listen to those different styles of music, become more comfortable. If you're like, oh, I want to put some jazz in it, but you're not a jazz harpist, well, you got to do your homework. That's basically what I'm saying here in listen or reach across the aisle. And finally, all right, so you have your theme, you've done your listening homework, and now I hope the performer feels a little more comfortable in mixing it up. The way I approach programming is that rather than trying to play a certain style of music or, certain styles of music, I'm really trying to convey a particular message by all musical means necessary. I'm not just throwing different things together, but it's very intentional because I'm looking for connections between the different styles and genres. The theme takes me part of the way. But at least for me, and I think where it can be really powerful for the listener is when the musical connections are also there. And that really is what drives the message of inclusivity home. In a few weeks, I'm going to present a program called The Things We Carry. It's inspired by an art exhibit, but to some extent. But I was really kind of thinking, I wanted to think about sort of where I started. I'm about to graduate from Juilliard, and I had the music of Margaret Bonds now in my ears, poetry of Langston Hughes, such as so many beautiful composers in my heart. But I didn't want to just kind of leave all the other stuff that I had been learning since I was a kid. I still really loved Bach, and I still love Scarlatti. And even though there may have been expectations that it wasn't something that I could do well, I know I could, and I loved it. So is there a way where I could really fully be my musical self on stage, right, Vincent? Bring all of those identities together. So the way I'm approaching this program is I'm first asking the audience to think about their names, because the name is something that we all carry. And if you kind of dissect your name, particularly maybe your last name, and you start doing history, you'll find that each of our names represents a unique intersection of often conflicting stories and histories. So you're kind of at this nexus of all these migrations and wars and, just all of these things kind of cobbled together to make you, you. And so to sort of flesh that out, I'm trying to, what I'm doing, hopefully successfully, is taking some of the solo pieces from my album and weaving them with the music of Bach and Scarlatti. But I'm doing so in such a way that I'm often writing transitions, or, I'm really kind of thinking about the musical connections between the different genres. So, for example, I start with a Bach Allemande, and then rather than go through the French suite, I pause and I do a short arrangement of a spiritual, which takes me then into the sarabande. Because for me, the sarabande in a suite has always been like the emotional heart, right? It's sort of where things slow down. It's stately, and we really can, I think, for a moment, lose ourselves in the melodies and the harmonies in a way that feels spiritual. So I'm drawing from that spiritual aspect of sarabands, and I'm bookending them with actual spirituals. So that's just another example of, not only just sort of mixing things up, but really being intentional about it. And what I'm not sharing with y'all is that I'm looking also at like how the melodies are arranged between the sarabande and the spirituals, and just seeing if there are connections even there that I can bring out. So I wrote up next, but these are kind of action items that I have to continue holding myself to after I've done this work. The first one is publishing arrangements, because often in our work as harpists, if we're trying to reach for other styles or just music or just access more, we have to do arranging. And that's a beautiful thing, but if it just sits with you, it sort of stops there, right? I think there's power when we can share those hours of long work of arranging and transcribing with others, especially students. And so publish your arrangements. Secondly, record or document what you've done. Again, just because music is not a vacuum. You spend so much time like working on the things by ourselves, but really it's about communicating and sharing. And then finally, just keep learning. That's kind of in line with the listen directive, but just for me, at least, I'm trying to always keep my ears open to tools that I didn't even think I realized I had, perhaps, or just experimenting with new ideas. And yeah, trying to just, again, for me, it's about communicating, and it's about communicating the connections between us, because I think that's where we are strongest. So that's really kind of the gist of my presentation. I know we've got 15 minutes left, so thank you for challenging me to sort of put into words the work that I try to do. If you want to know what I'm up to more immediately, you can follow me on Instagram at FeatherstonHarp, or if you want to know just more about my background and where I'm playing next, you can also visit my website.